Hello and welcome to Perspectives, the weekly edition. I'm Sebastian Gomes, your guest host for this episode, Catholic Update for the spring of 2016. We have best-selling author of the Vatican Diaries and the Vatican Prophecies and longtime Vaticanista, John Thavis, here with us in the studio today. John, always good to see you. Thanks for coming by. There's always so many things to talk about in the Catholic world, current events going on that need to be analyzed and broken down, and at this particular time, one of the things that jumps off the page is the Pope's recent Apostolic Exhortation, Amoris Laetitia, which is the concluding document of the two-stage Synod of Bishops on the Family that we've been covering and talking about over the last 2 years. The document is finally out. What were your initial impressions of it?
Well, it's a very collegial document in the sense that, the Pope did not come up with any grand new announcements or teachings. He pretty much followed the guidance of the bishops who met twice in Rome during 2 synod sessions. So in that sense, I think he very much respected what he heard from the bishops. He's a good listener. The thing that jumped out at me was something I read in the first few pages, where the Pope introduced everything by saying, look, not everything that I'm going to say here should be seen in the light of a new teaching. Not everything needs to be determined by the magisterium. And so I think he was signaling already to readers right off the bat, if you're going to be looking for a new verdict on, the policy toward divorced and remarried Catholics, for example, or, new norms for how we treat people in X, Y, or Z circumstance, you're not going to find it here. Instead, what he said is we need pastoral flexibility. And he reminded pastors that they are not just gatekeepers. They are not only teachers. They are people who are spiritual guides for the Catholics, individuals and couples and families who are trying to live up to the Church's ideals, but probably falling short. And so right off the bat, he kind of lowered expectations, I think, for those who are looking for some grand new announcements.
Right. Now you mentioned the question of divorced and remarried Catholics and the reception of communion. That was obviously the big issue in our part of the world during these synods. And everybody wants to know, you sort of alluded to it, did something change? Because the synod essentially left the door open a little bit, I think, at the end of the synod in 2015. So what do we make now when we look at that specific issue from what Francis's exhortation says?
I think the Pope also left the door open.
Okay.
I think, once again, he respected what the bishops concluded. And what the bishops were talking about was the idea that, yes, the Church has a teaching about divorced and remarried Catholics. And right now that teaching is that they should not present themselves for communion unless they've had an annulment. But the Pope also reminds pastors here that we also need to respect the human conscience. We need to respect people for what, how far can they meet our Church teaching? And not use a Church teaching or a rule in order to exclude people who are trying to be a part of this community. And so, once again, the Church should not see itself as gatekeeper. It should see itself as spiritual guides. And, this is perhaps revolutionary in with a small r, not a capital R, because there's a certain level of ambiguity here. But I think, once again, that's what the Pope is saying, is that as pastors, we're not here to issue edicts or norms or make people fit into our categories. We're here to meet people where they live, find out where they're at, and help them come to accept Church teaching.
And if you know what the Church has taught in the past, 40, 50 years, let's say, about some of these issues, you know that there's no leap that's taken place. It seems to be more of a change of emphasis, where at one time we knew the rules first, but the pastoral side was sort of back here. It's sort of shifted now, and the pastoral approach is kind of front and center again, as it were, under Francis.
That's right. And so if I'm a priest in a local parish, what I would take away from this document is that, look, I don't necessarily have to be looking to Rome for a rule to fit every circumstance I'm dealing with. I need to go back and rely on that old tradition that the Catholic Church has, which is you respect the human conscience. You talk to the person involved, you guide them along the path, but you don't try to exclude them from the sacraments in every case.
Now, once the exhortation came out, the blogosphere, the Twittersphere, everything, Catholic news outlets were writing about this and commenting on it. And I noticed that there were some, a significant amount of people saying, well, this is the Pope's personal opinion. It's not necessarily a magisterial teaching. And so the question is, how binding is this? Is this just the Pope's personal opinion? We had the two-stage synod. How are Catholics supposed to understand the authoritativeness of this document?
Right. Well, this is not an ex cathedra pronouncement in any sense.
Right.
In fact, the Pope isn't, as I say, is not issuing any new doctrinal norms. So, how much respect should be given it? I think that's a discussion that would interest canon lawyers more than it would Pope Francis or the people in the pews. Pope Francis, I think, speaks very forcefully and clearly here. He's trying to orient the entire church toward a more pastoral approach, a less doctrinal approach, and for those who have ears, I think it will be important.
It's true, and the people who tend to focus on how legitimate or authoritative this document is tend to miss a lot of the substance of the document itself, which is extremely rich.
That's right.
One of the sort of novel things about this document is the Pope's really astute observations about married life.
Yeah.
Sexuality, relationships, all these things. Have you ever heard or seen a Pope speaking so intimately about marriage like this?
I covered John Paul II and of course Pope Benedict, and every time a Pope kind of ventures into this terrain, I kind of cringe a little, because I'm
Right.
a husband and a father, and I say I hope they're being very careful about what they say, because there are a lot of false steps that can be made.
Right.
Pope Francis, he seemed to, I don't know what it is, maybe as a pastor he did a lot of listening, because he seemed to know exactly what family life is all about.
I've heard that from so many couples.
Yeah.
People who are married and have families say that he gets it. He knows.
And he kept it on a very simple level. Look, if you're trying to discipline a child, here's what to avoid, here's what to do. And you know what? It all makes sense. Very simple things. So he's down to earth. As I say, he must have done a lot of listening when he was Archbishop in Buenos Aires.
Right. No, it's definitely worth a read, and multiple reads at that. We're going to have to take a quick break here, John, but when we come back, we're going to look at another topic that Pope Francis is very much interested in, refugees, and his recent trip he made to Lesbos, Greece. We'll be back in a minute.
Ringrazio quanti hanno accompagnato con la preghiera la visita che ho compiuto ieri nell'isola di Lesbo in Grecia. Ai profughi e al popolo greco ho portato la solidarietà della Chiesa. Erano con me il patriarca ecumenico Bartolomeo e l'arcivescovo Hieronymos di Atene e tutte le Grecie, a significare l'unità nella carità di tutti i discepoli del Signore. Abbiamo visitato uno dei campi dei rifugiati. Provenivano dall'Iraq, dall'Afghanistan, dalla Siria, dall'Africa, da tanti paesi.
Father, please bless me. Please bless me because I'm Christian. Hallelujah. 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 Oh, Jesus, thank you. Thank you, God. Thank you. Thank you.
God bless you. Abbiamo salutato circa 300 di questi profughi, uno a uno, tutti e tre. Il patriarca Bartolomeo, l'arcivescovo Hieronymos e io. Tanti di loro erano bambini Alcuni di loro, di questi bambini, hanno assistito alla morte dei genitori e di compagni. Alcuni di loro morti annegati in mare. Ho visto tanto dolore.
So the Pope has recently made this trip to Lesbos, Greece, to really be in solidarity with refugees. And one of the things that was really interesting about this trip was how quickly it came together. So I wanted to ask you, because you've covered the Vatican for so long, is this normal that the Pope would sort of throw together a trip like this and
It is
go?
not normal. Vatican likes to plan things years in advance, and papal trips are no different. Under John Paul II, of course, I traveled with him all around the world. I traveled with Benedict, and normally, months or years to plan a papal trip. Now, in this case, of course, there was a crisis situation going on a small island, and Pope Francis wanted to go there. And I can imagine the conversation going something like, the Pope says, I want to go to this island, and his aides saying, well, Holy Father, will take weeks or months to plan, and the Pope saying, that's fine, I want to go Saturday, make it happen. And they did make it happen. All credit to them, because there's a lot of logistics and security to deal with, and it was a highly successful trip. I guess some people would see it as symbolic. I see it as more than symbolic. I think the Pope is doing something concrete. He brought back 12 refugees with him on his plane.
Right.
It's a small step. He left behind almost 4,000 refugees, but he's saying, I think, to the Catholic Church, look, we preach social justice, we preach charity. Let's not just make this about words. Let's actually take some concrete steps, and here's one. It's kind of like when he put showers on the first floor of the Apostolic Palace for the street people.
Right.
It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. Here's a Pope who wants to do things, even if they're small things.
No, it's not just a message to the Catholic Church, it's also a message to countries. Countries in Europe, and we know just some of the political tensions that have been raised, in recent weeks and recent months, and most recently, this whole deal to send refugees back to Turkey who actually land on European soil seeking, refuge. So, what's the political implication of this trip of Pope Francis to Lesbos?
Well, I think the implication is pretty clear. He made the trip a month after the EU decided we're going to send these people back to Turkey, and we're not letting them into the EU anymore. And so the implication's certainly there. I think, though, really what the Pope's most effective message is that these people are human beings. He went there, he gave a human face to what is just known in the news as a refugee problem. And, when he held up that child's drawing on the plane back from Lesbos, and how the child had depicted, his ordeal, that was a moving moment.
Yeah.
And so by making this problem human, I think he's reminding everybody in Europe that you can't just turn your back on human beings. It's not just a political issue.
Now, another interesting dynamic of this trip was who the Pope was traveling with. Someone who we've come to know is a good friend, a dear friend to Pope Francis, and that's the Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew, who is the head of the Orthodox Church. The Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church are separate. They're not together, but these two seem to have a wonderful relationship. And, the two of them are singing from the same hymnal, if you will, on some major, major issues that are affecting the world. So
they really are. I saw this begin a little bit under Pope John Paul II, who went to Greece and started creating much better relations with the Ecumenical Patriarch, and then Benedict as well. And Pope Francis has really taken it up, especially on two issues. First, protection of the world's environment, which has been a big issue for the Ecumenical Patriarchate. And now the question of immigrants, which is something very close to the Patriarch because, of course, he lives and resides in Greece.
Right.
So it's right there on his doorstep. And I think this is significant. I think it shows that for Pope Francis, ecumenical dialogue is important, but the theological level of ecumenical dialogue has kind of stalled a little bit in recent years. In a sense, they've come as far as they can go right now, and to take further steps is going to require time. But in the meantime, they can do some very active cooperation on social justice issues.
Right.
And here is a perfect example. The two men were side by side.
Let's talk a little bit about what this means for the international community, because the refugee crisis is a global crisis. It's affecting everybody. I mean, here in Canada, actually we're very proud that we've opened our doors and welcomed thousands of refugees from Syria and other countries. But what does this mean for the world, for the human family? I mean, to see these two Christian leaders going to the heart of where these people are suffering, these people are imprisoned in some camps, or they're being shipped back to their home countries in a time of trial. What's the message to the world community?
Well, I think the message, once again, is we're not simply dealing with abstract notions. We're dealing with real human people who are suffering. And I think, how deeply this message cuts through depends. There are areas of the world, including the United States, where immigration is a very hot political topic.
Right.
And, you can get into shouting matches over this while kind of forgetting the human beings. And so to see Pope Francis accomplish this very simple gesture, bringing back 12 Muslim immigrants back to Rome, was a huge gesture on a human level, on an interreligious level as well. I think it speaks to the Muslim world.
Yeah.
I think it shows that, look,
Christianity
doesn't create categories like this.
Yeah.
Charity extends to everyone.
I was going to say all of the refugees that the Pope brought back with him to Rome were all Muslims.
They happen to be Muslim,
Yeah.
yes, and it just worked out that way.
Yeah.
And as someone asked him about that, what about the Christians? He said, well, we looked at some, but they didn't have their papers in order. This is the way it worked out, and I think the Pope said something like, we don't categorize people that way anyway. They're
just
human beings.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, John, we have to take another quick break, but when we come back, more politics. Presidential candidate Bernie Sanders makes his way to the Vatican. Astounding. We'll be back right after this. What do you like most about Pope Francis personally? I mean, just when you watch him, when you see him, when you hear him.
Maybe his audacity. He's a very audacious guy, fearless guy, and he's a very smart guy. And very often what I say to people who are criticizing me, I say, you think I'm radical? Read what this guy is writing. Do you see what he's writing? It goes a lot deeper, in fact, than the kind of platform that I work around. So his courage, his willingness to speak deep truths in a very corrupt and sick society is something that moves me very, very much.
If you had the chance to speak to him one-on-one, what would you say to him?
I would simply thank him. I mean, his voice is having a profound impact in so many ways. And again, it is not just pointing out the disparities of income or the dispossessed or the unemployed or the poor and what's happening to them. It is reminding us that life simply cannot be about the accumulation of more and more money and turning our backs on the children and the elderly and the poor. That as human beings, to live a good life, we have got to see the suffering that is around us and to try to address that suffering. That makes us happier and better people, and that's what he's reminding us of.
All right, John, another very interesting recent event. Presidential candidate Bernie Sanders made his way to the Vatican to give a major lecture, but this is astounding, in the middle of the campaign. So how did this whole thing come about? How did he end up at the Vatican?
Providence. No, I think the timing was unusual, certainly. He ended up at the Vatican because the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences invited him, along with some other very high-profile leaders around the world, to be part of an international conference. Now, when the invitation was announced, of course, Bernie said he'd be happy to go. It was a little unusual because he was taking 2 days out of a very active political campaign, kind of the height of his campaign before the New York primary,
Yeah.
and flying off to Rome. There are a lot of different interpretations of this, okay? Was Bernie trying to get the Catholic vote? Was the Pope inviting Bernie, or was it the Vatican? And you can give 1,000 different answers. My reading is he was invited by the Pontifical Academy. I know the head of the Pontifical Academy fairly well. He's an Argentinian. He knows the Pope very well, and I don't think he would have invited Bernie Sanders without running it by the Pope first.
Okay, interesting.
But I think the Vatican went out of its way really to calibrate this in a way. There was no formal papal audience,
Right.
and there was no photo op. So, in a sense, the Pope was being as careful as he could be, but still, he was saying, yeah, invite this man. I think the Pope realizes that perhaps of all the U.S. candidates, Bernie Sanders sounds a lot like he does on some of these issues, on immigration, on the rigged world economy, on militarism. These are big issues, and we've seen Pope Francis before kind of extend the area of dialogue when inviting guests to the Vatican.
Right.
He invited Naomi Klein, for example, to another Vatican conference.
Right.
And these are people who would not have probably come to the Vatican under previous popes. I think Pope Francis is saying, look, we need dialogue with people of goodwill. We may not share all their positions, they may not share all of ours, but these issues are important enough so that let's hear their voice.
I find it fascinating that Bernie Sanders, who is a Jew and has no particular affinity with the church or anything, is so outspoken positively about Francis. I mean, he's quoting him all the time. I mean, we had the opportunity to do a few interviews with him, and he's very, very positive. So it was fascinating that the two of them actually had the chance to meet. Although, as you mentioned, I don't think that there's any photographs that
There's
we
no
know
photo,
of. Okay.
unless it surfaces later. But I think both sides were trying to be careful not to be seen as exploiting the Pope,
Right.
and second, not to be exploited. As for Bernie Sanders, yeah, he was born a Jew, and he comes from, but the Judaic-Christian tradition is, the Bible. It's helping the poor.
Right,
It's
right.
helping the needy. It's attentive to. These are the values that really underscore everything Pope Francis is trying to do. So there's certainly common ground there.
Do you think this helps the Bernie campaign?
I don't think it hurts it. On the other hand, I'm not sure it translates into votes for him. There used to be such a thing as the Catholic vote in the United States, but I think that disappeared decades ago. Catholics are so much integrated in many ways, economically to a large degree, that you can't really decipher Catholic voting patterns that way. In fact, from what I've seen right now, a majority of Catholics in the country support either Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton. And given the Pope's words about Donald Trump, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Because the Pope was
To say
asked
the
last
least.
year about Donald Trump and wanting to build a wall on the border of Mexico, and the Pope said basically it's not a Christian thing to only think about building walls and not bridges.
Right.
So again, the Pope tries not to be political, but sometimes he can't help himself.
Right. Now, he certainly seems comfortable in the political side of things.
does.
I mean, it's very important to him. John, thanks very much for being here.
It's
Always
been
great
my
to
pleasure,
talk
Sebastian.
to you. John Thavis is best-selling author of the Vatican Diaries and his most recent book, The Vatican Prophecies. You can follow his work from his website, jonthavis.com. He also is a commentator of some current events in the Catholic Church, a great resource for anybody out there interested in following what's going on. And remember, you can always get in touch with us at Salt and Light by phone or by email. We'd love to hear from you. And be sure to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, and visit our website for more episodes of Perspectives, the weekly edition. Thanks for joining us today. For Deacon Pedro, I'm Sebastian Gomes. Take care.